The ferry, a rust-streaked hulk named the Osprey, churned through the gray-green swells, its engines a monotonous thrum beneath Dean's worn boots. He leaned against the railing, the salt spray whipping his face, a cold balm against the raw ache in his chest that never quite receded. He watched the mainland shrink, its jagged coastline dissolving into the persistent mist, and felt a peculiar blend of relief and apprehension. Solitude was what he craved, what he desperately needed to mend the fractured pieces of himself. But this island, even from a distance, promised a solitude that felt less like peace and more like an abyss. His grandfather, a man Dean had barely known, had lived out his last days on this isolated rock, tending a lighthouse that had long since been automated. The inheritance, a small, weather-beaten cottage nestled beside the old beacon, had arrived like a grim invitation, a chance to outrun the echoes of a life now irrevocably altered. Dean, a cartographer by trade, had always found solace in lines and contours, in the definitive edges of a map. Now his own life felt like a territory blurred and undefined. Its shores were craggy, fringed with kelp, and the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of brine and something else. A damp, earthy decay that seemed to cling to the very air. As the ferry rounded a headland, a cluster of derelict structures appeared, hunched and skeletal against the sky. One, larger than the others, stood out. A vast, decaying monument of corrugated iron and broken windows, its roof sagging like a defeated creature. This, he realized with a jolt, was the island's abandoned industry. A massive, derelict factory that looked as if it had been consumed by the very elements it had once sought to harness. The ferry shuddered, docking with a groan of stressed metal. A single figure, the island's grizzled caretaker, waited on the small, weed-choked pier, his face a roadmap of wind and sun. He gestured vaguely up a winding track, his eyes, the color of deep sea, betraying no warmth. Dean retrieved his bags, a meager collection of essentials, and stepped onto the shore. The ground felt soft underfoot, a mixture of damp earth and crushed shells. The air was unnervingly still, save for the mournful cries of gulls circling high above the factory, their calls sounding less like birds and more like keening spirits. The caretaker merely grunted, pointing towards a rusted utility vehicle. As they drove, the track narrowed, winding past gnarled, wind-stunted trees that clawed at the sky. The factory receded behind them, but its presence lingered, a heavy weight on the horizon. The silence was profound, broken only by the vehicle's rumbling engine and the distant, ceaseless roar of the ocean. He'd learned to distrust his senses since the tragedy. The cottage finally appeared, perched precariously on a sheer cliff overlooking the turbulent expanse of the sea. It was smaller than he'd imagined, its whitewash peeling, its windows like vacant eyes. A thick mantle of ivy clung to the cottage walls, crawling over the roof, a slow green consumption. The caretaker killed the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening, amplifying the relentless crash of waves against the rocks below, and what the sea brings. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the churning gray expanse, a strange glint in his eyes, before turning and driving back down the track, leaving Dean utterly alone. Dean stood for a long moment, the salty wind tearing at his jacket, the key heavy in his palm. He approached the front door, its paint blistered and flaking, and pushed the key into the lock. It turned with a groan of rusted mechanisms. The door creaked inward, revealing a cavern of gloom and the pervasive scent of damp, dust, and something else. A faint, unsettling aroma of brine and decay, far deeper than mere sea air. It clung to the wallpaper, to the threadbare rug that covered the floorboards. He stepped inside, the floorboards sighing beneath his weight. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows. He found the light switch, flipping it, but nothing happened. The power was off. Of course. He pulled a small, battery-powered lantern from his bag. A rickety table, 2 mismatched chairs, a fireplace choked with cobwebs. As he moved deeper into the cottage, a low, rhythmic thrumming began, faint but insistent, vibrating through the floorboards. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the waves. It was too regular, too deep, like the distant, slow beat of a monstrous heart. Dean paused, his breath catching in his throat. He held the lantern aloft, its beam sweeping across the peeling wallpaper, the cracked plaster. The sound seemed to come from beneath the cottage, a deep, resonant hum that pulsed through the very foundations. He told himself it was the old house settling, the distant machinery of the automated lighthouse, anything but what his instincts screamed at him. He forced himself to move, his cartographer's eye scanning the room, trying to find a logical source. But there was none. He watched the island grow from a hazy smudge on the horizon into a craggy silhouette, crowned by the solitary sentinel of the lighthouse. The cottage, perched precariously on a sea-battered bluff, was smaller than he'd imagined, yet somehow more imposing. Its windows, like vacant eyes, stared out at the churning expanse of ocean. He spent the first day simply existing, moving through the silence, the echo of his own footsteps, a stark reminder of his solitude. By the second morning, the island's relentless rhythm began to assert itself. Dean, a man who measured his life by the precision of lines on a map, found himself increasingly disoriented by the sea. The tides, usually predictable, seemed to possess a peculiar will. The ocean felt closer, deeper, more alive than any body of water he had ever charted. He was used to the predictable geometry of cities, not the wild, untamed chaos of the coast. At first, he dismissed them as the wind, a mournful lament whistling through the cottage's ill-fitting panes and under the warped doorframes. But the sound was too articulate, too close to language. It wasn't the roar of the surf, nor the shriek of a gull. It was a low, resonant murmur, like a vast choir singing beneath the waves. The individual voices indistinguishable, yet collectively forming a single, undulating hum. It seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of the island, seeping through the stone walls, clinging to the heavy, damp air. He pressed his palms against his ears, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to resonate within his bones, a low, insistent thrumming that threatened to unravel the edges of his thoughts. He told himself he was tired, stressed, that his grief was finally manifesting as auditory hallucinations. It had to be. Driven by a restless unease, Dean began to explore the cottage more thoroughly. His grandfather, a man he barely remembered, had been an enigma, and the cottage was a testament to a life lived on the fringes. In a dusty, forgotten corner of the study, beneath a stack of old nautical almanacs, he found it, a heavy, leather-bound journal. Its cover was water-damaged, the leather warped and cracked, and the pages within were stiff, some fused together by moisture. His grandfather's sprawling, almost illegible hand filled page after page. Dean carefully peeled back the brittle cover. The first few entries were mundane observations about the weather, lighthouse maintenance, the passage of ships. But soon, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew frantic, the lines slanting wildly across the page. Then he found the phrases, repeated over and over, scrawled in thick, desperate strokes. The deep song. It calls, the pact is broken, they stir below. There were references to ancient rituals, to something awakening after centuries of slumber. Dean remembered the unusual tides he had witnessed. He ran a thumb over the raised, crinkled ink of one entry, his skin prickling. The factory. The old place. He hadn't noticed a factory on the island. He tried to rationalize it all away. His grandfather, a solitary man on a lonely rock, perhaps his mind had simply frayed. The ramblings of an old man, isolated, driven to paranoia by the ceaseless roar of the ocean. The drawings were just fanciful nightmares, born of solitude and too much time spent staring at the endless, indifferent sea. Yet the words, the factory, the old place, it remembers, burrowed into his mind. He needed to see this place. If he could find it, if he could see it, perhaps he could find a rational explanation for what his grandfather had written, for the escalating strangeness. The next morning, armed with a compass and his own cartographer's instinct, Dean set out to find the old factory. He trekked along the coastline, the air thick with the smell of brine and damp earth, the incessant murmur of the sea a constant companion. After an hour of scrambling over slick rocks and through thorny thickets, he saw it. Tucked into a secluded cove, shrouded by a perpetual mist, stood a hulking derelict factory. Its brickwork was crumbling, windows shattered, and the skeletal remains of rusted machinery jutted out like broken bones. A single massive chimney, cracked down its length, leaned precariously against the bruised sky. The very air around it felt heavy, stagnant, as if the place held its breath. As he drew closer, a faint metallic tang, like old blood and rust, permeated the air, mingling with the salt. The ferry's distant horn, a mournful lament across the water, had become the island's default heartbeat. Dean had spent the first few days in a fog of his own, the cottage a silent, cold echo of his grief. His grandfather's journal, its leather-binding brittle, called to him from the dusty shelf. He needed answers, not just about the man, but about the island itself and the strange, unsettling atmosphere that clung to it like the persistent mist. He started with the island's small, public collection of books, tucked away in the back room of the general store. The proprietor, a stoic woman with hands gnarled from years of hauling crates, merely nodded when Dean asked about local history. He found a handful of slim volumes, bound in faded cloth, smelling of mildew and forgotten lore. Most were mundane accounts of fishing harvests and lighthouse repairs. Its pages, yellowed and fragile, spoke of ancient rites performed by the earliest settlers, of offerings made to the sea to ensure bountiful catches and calm waters. There were vague, unsettling references to a sunken city, not a physical place on any chart, but a spectral domain beneath the waves, guarding secrets best left undisturbed. He felt a familiar determination rise within him, a need to map this unknown territory, even if it meant venturing into dangerous currents. Back at the cottage, the grandfather's journal felt heavier in his hands. The scrawled entries, once maddeningly vague, now seemed to align with the folklore he'd just read. The pact, for now. And later, the tides turn, the old ways forgotten. What stirs beneath? Dean traced the faded ink with a fingertip. His grandfather, it seemed, had been more than just a reclusive keeper of the light. He had been a guardian of something far older, far more terrible. The journal also contained a crude, hand-drawn map. Not of the island's surface, but of its rocky coastline, with certain points marked by strange, almost runic symbols. One symbol, a spiral within a triangle, appeared several times, once next to a faded, almost illegible word. Factory. The next morning, the island was shrouded in a fog so dense it muffled all sound, transforming the world into a canvas of gray. Dean consulted the map again. The symbol for factory pointed inland, towards the island's desolate northern stretch. He pulled on his thickest oilskin coat, the smell of damp wool and old salt clinging to it, and ventured out. The path quickly dissolved into a barely discernible track, hemmed in by skeletal trees whose branches clawed at the air. The air grew heavy, smelling of rust and decay beneath the pervasive damp. He found it eventually, a hulking silhouette against the swirling mist, the derelict factory. Its corrugated iron walls were pocked with gaping holes, windows shattered like missing teeth. The roof sagged in places, a patchwork of moss and broken timbers. A rusted sign, barely legible, once proclaimed it a fish canning operation, long since abandoned. The air here was thick with the metallic tang of decay, a sharp counterpoint to the salt-laden breeze. Dean pushed through a warped metal door, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the cavernous space was a graveyard of rusted machinery, silent and still. This was a place where things had been processed, consumed, forgotten, and perhaps where something else had begun to stir, leaving its mark. That night, the dreams came. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Shapes writhed just beyond the periphery of his vision, immense and formless, their movements stirring currents in the black liquid. He saw flashes of ancient stone, intricately carved with symbols that mirrored those in his grandfather's journal, slick with an oily sheen. He awoke with a gasp, the hum still resonating in his inner ear, his heart hammering against his ribs. He swung his legs out of bed, his skin clammy. He looked down. A thin, iridescent film shimmered on the wood, a milky, blue-green substance that pulsed faintly with its own light. He knelt, touching it cautiously. It felt like living slime, cool and gelatinous. It wasn't just on the floor. Tendrils of it clung to the base of his bedside table, and a small patch glowed eerily on the sill of the closed window. It was bioluminescent algae, vibrant and otherworldly, growing in places where no moisture should have reached. It smelled faintly of ozone and something sharp, like old pennies. The entity, whatever it was no longer content to stir beneath the waves. It was reaching, creeping, leaving its mark. And it had found him. The smell of brine and damp earth clung to his oilskin as Dean plunged into the fog. It was a living thing, a thick white shroud that swallowed the familiar path within a dozen paces. The air grew colder with every step inland, the sound of the churning sea fading into a distant, muted thrum. He consulted the map again, its crinkled surface slick with condensation. The symbol for factory beckoned, a stark outline against the faded parchment. He pushed through gnarled, salt-blasted shrubs, their skeletal branches scraping against his coat, their leaves slick and cold. The ground underfoot became uneven, a treacherous mix of loose stones and boggy patches that threatened to pull his boots down into the unseen muck. It was an enormous, hulking shape, its contours vague and menacing. He approached cautiously, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The derelict factory loomed, a skeletal monument of rusted corrugated iron and shattered windows. Its roof had long since collapsed in places, exposing the grimy interior to the elements. A broken sign, its paint flaked and faded, dangled precariously above what might have once been a main entrance, creaking a mournful tune in the barely perceptible breeze. The heavy door, hanging by a single hinge, groaned open with a shuddering sigh when he pushed it. Dean stepped over collapsed machinery, its iron bones twisted into grotesque sculptures. Here, amid the wreckage, he found them. The symbols. Carved into a support beam, half obscured by a hanging sheet of rusted metal, was the same spiraling pattern he'd seen in his grandfather's cottage. Below it, etched with a crude, desperate hand, were several more, resembling archaic aquatic life forms, tentacled, finned, with too many eyes. Nearby, on a makeshift altar fashioned from 3 stacked crates, sat a collection of smooth, gray stones, each one wet to the touch, as if recently drawn from the sea. A small, tarnished silver locket lay among them, open, revealing a faded photograph of a young woman he didn't recognize. Was this a ward? Or something else entirely? His gaze swept across the floor and his heart gave a sudden, hard thump. They weren't quite dry, shimmering faintly in his lantern's light, like oil slicks on water. They looked too fresh to be old machinery residue. His grandfather had been here recently, and he hadn't just been looking for answers. He'd been performing some kind of ritual, leaving offerings, perhaps even sacrifices. He backed away slowly, the air suddenly feeling heavy, suffocating. The return journey was a blur of heightened senses. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crash of waves seemed amplified, imbued with a sinister intent. He imagined eyes watching him from the swirling fog, forms shifting just beyond his periphery. Back in the cottage, the familiar scent of old wood and sea salt offered little comfort. He stripped off his oilskin, his hands trembling slightly, and threw it over a chair. A moment later, he noticed it. The chair was no longer where he'd left it. It had shifted an inch, perhaps two, closer to the hearth. He dismissed it as his own carelessness, a slight bump as he'd shed the heavy coat. But then he saw the book on the small table beside his armchair, a navigational almanac he'd been perusing earlier. It was open to a different page than he remembered, and a small, smooth pebble, identical to those in the factory, lay upon its spine. He hadn't placed it there. A low, resonant hum began, almost imperceptible at first, like the distant vibration of a ship's engine deep beneath the waves. It resonated not in his ears, but in the very bones of the cottage. A deep, pervasive thrum that seemed to sink into his own marrow. It was hypnotic, subtly disorienting. He walked into the small washroom, splashing cold water on his face. He looked up at his reflection in the tarnished mirror. For a split second, his features seemed to ripple, to elongate, his eyes widening into vast black pools, his skin taking on a faint, slick sheen. Then, just as quickly, it snapped back to normal. It couldn't have been real, just a trick of the light, fatigue. But the image persisted in his mind, a terrifying echo. The hum intensified, a low guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. It filled the cottage, pressing in on him, making his teeth ache. As he fumbled with a match, a movement caught his eye. Just beyond the window, where the fog pressed thick against the glass, a shape coalesced. It was impossibly tall, sinuous, and utterly silent. He saw no distinct features, only the suggestion of vastness, of immense power, of something ancient and hungry. It paused, seeming to fix him with an unseen gaze, and then, as quickly as it appeared, it flowed back into the impenetrable gray, leaving only the memory of its aqueous form. The hum was a roar now, vibrating through the floorboards, through his very skull. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, palpable, suffocating. It had been there, just outside, watching him. He wasn't alone. And whatever it was no longer content to merely lurk beneath the waves. It was here, on the island, pressing against the very walls of his inherited sanctuary. The solitude he craved had become a terrifying vulnerability. The fog thickened, a clammy embrace that stole the horizon and muffled the world. Dean pressed on, his oilskin slick with moisture, the cold seeping into his bones. The thrum of the sea, once a constant companion, now seemed to recede, replaced by a profound, echoing silence that pressed in on his ears. The path, barely more than a deer trail, dissolved into tangled gorse and spongy moss. Then, through the swirling vapor, a gaunt silhouette emerged. Not a natural formation, but a jagged, skeletal geometry of rusted metal and crumbling brick. It loomed, formless at first, then resolving into the hulking remains of a derelict factory. Its windows, shattered black eyes, stared out from a facade choked with ivy, the roof a gaping maw against the unseen sky. He hadn't known this place existed on the small island. It felt ancient, but not with the earth's timelessness. Rather, with the weary decay of something once vital, now left to rot. He pushed through a sagging chain-link fence, the rusted links groaning. Machinery, monstrous and inert, stood like petrified beasts, draped in cobwebs and rust. He moved deeper, his boots crunching on broken glass and loose debris. In a corner, half buried under a collapsed section of roof, he saw it. A rough-hewn wooden crate, surprisingly intact. He knelt, brushing away the grime. It bore no markings, no labels. With a grunt, he forced the lid open. They were abstract, vaguely aquatic, with too many limbs and unsettlingly blank surfaces. These weren't decorative. They felt resonant. He closed the crate, a sudden urge to flee overriding his curiosity. He pulled his grandfather's journal closer, its worn leather a familiar comfort in the growing unease. He needed to understand. He spoke of a deep bargain, struck generations ago, not with man, but with the other. A price paid for quietude, for the island's continued existence. My father, his father, they kept it. The offering, the song. Dean thought it superstition, foolishness. But the tides. His grandfather hadn't just observed. He had been involved, a participant in some ancient, terrible agreement. The journal entries grew more disjointed, describing a specific ritual, a binding of the deep song. It spoke of certain locations on the island, of offerings made at the lowest tides, of a specific sequence of chants, though the words were rendered in an unrecognizable, angular script that made his eyes ache to look at. The song grows louder. It is not just sound. It is thought. It seeps into the mind, into the dreams. It wants release. It demands what is owed. As Dean read, a low thrum began in the very air around him. It wasn't the wind, nor the distant sea. It was internal, resonating in his chest, vibrating through the soles of his feet. The words on the page seemed to shimmer, the ink momentarily blurring, then reforming. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the sensation persisted. The deep song. The walls of the cottage seemed to breathe, the familiar timber twisting and expanding in his peripheral vision. The glass of water on the table rippled, though no one had touched it. He glanced at the obsidian figures from the factory, and for a terrifying instant, he thought he saw the carved limbs subtly shift, the blank surfaces glinting with an unholy intelligence. He gripped the journal tighter, knuckles white. This wasn't just imagination. This was real. The journal continued, its later pages stained and dog-eared. There was a crude sketch, a cross-section of the lighthouse itself, with an arrow pointing to a section beneath the foundations. The lowest place, the heart of the binding, where the song is held, where the offering must be made, the crypt. Do not open, hidden beneath the lighthouse. His grandfather, knowing this, had still lived here, guarding it. He scanned the cottage, his gaze falling to the stone floor near the old stove. There, partially obscured by a rug, was a faint seam in the flagstones he'd always dismissed as a repair. Driven by an instinct he couldn't ignore, a desperate need to understand, to see, Dean moved the rug. The seam was clearer now, running in a perfect rectangle. He knelt, tracing the outline with a trembling finger. He pressed, pushed, searched for a latch or a handle. Nothing. But the journal had mentioned a mechanism. He reread the frantic lines, his eyes darting across the page until he found it. A specific sequence of pressure points, described alongside a cryptic symbol. He found the corresponding symbol carved into the stone of the fireplace hearth, faint but unmistakable. Following the grandfather's instructions, he pressed firmly on 3 specific points around the rectangular seam in the floor. A low, grinding groan echoed from beneath his feet. A gust of air, heavy and ancient, smelling of wet rock, stagnant water, and something else. Something indescribably old and malevolent wafted up from the depths. A cold dread had indeed settled deep in Dean's stomach, a heavy, calcified weight. He knelt, his knees protesting on the gritty flagstones, and ran his fingers along the faint seam near the old stove. It was barely visible, a hairline fracture in the stone's continuity, precisely where the rug had been carelessly tossed. He'd overlooked it countless times, dismissed it as a natural imperfection. Now it screamed of deliberate concealment. His grandfather, guarding something beneath the lighthouse. The thought prickled at his skin, 100 tiny needles of unease. He pushed the heavy cast-iron stove aside with a grunt, revealing more of the flagstone. The seam was clearer now, tracing a rough rectangle. He probed the edges, feeling for a purchase. There, a small, almost imperceptible depression, cool and smooth against his fingertip. He pressed. Nothing. He pressed harder, a dull click echoing in the sudden silence of the cottage. With a groan, a section of the floor, perhaps 3 feet by 4, began to sink, slow and deliberate, on a hidden counterweight. Dean recoiled, a shiver tracing its way down his spine. The opening revealed a crude, unlit shaft descending into profound blackness. He fumbled for his lantern, his hands trembling slightly, and switched it on. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a series of rough-hewn steps carved into the rock, slick with condensation. He took a deep breath, the air tasting foul, and began his descent. The walls were rough, wet stone, dripping with brackish water that pooled on the steps. He imagined the vast, churning ocean just beyond these thin rock walls, its unseen presence pressing in. The shaft twisted and turned, far longer than he anticipated, leading him deeper, away from the familiar foundations of the cottage. The sound of his own breathing, ragged and loud, was the only constant. Then, the steps ended abruptly. His lantern beam cut across a vast, cavernous space. He stood at the edge of a wide, unpaved floor, leading into what appeared to be an enormous derelict factory built directly into the island's core. Broken machinery, hulking shapes covered in a thick layer of grime and something resembling calcified salt, lay scattered across the floor like forgotten behemoths. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was an entire subterranean complex, swallowed by the earth and forgotten by time. His gaze swept across the silent, decaying expanse. In the center, where a colossal, rusted crane once might have stood, something pulsed with a dim, internal light. It drew him forward, a terrible magnetism he couldn't resist. The light emanated from a structure unlike anything he had ever seen. He reached out a trembling hand, drawn by an irresistible curiosity and a horrifying sense of inevitability. A scream tore through him, not from his own throat, but from within his mind. The hum intensified, becoming a deafening roar. Images flooded his perception, overwhelming his senses. He was no longer in the derelict factory. He was everywhere and nowhere. He saw the island, not as a solitary landmass, but as a small, insignificant speck. A vast, inchoate intelligence reached for him, not with tendrils or claws, but with a presence so immense it threatened to shatter his very being. He saw the island sinking, slowly, inexorably, into the maw of something ancient and hungry. He saw the cottage, his grandfather's home, crumbling into dust, drawn down into the crushing depths, not dying, but unmaking. The vision was horrifyingly clear, utterly devoid of mercy or malice, simply an overwhelming instinctual consumption. The entity didn't hate. It simply was. And its existence meant the end of all others. And Dean, by his presence, by his inheritance, had opened the door. He gasped, tearing his hand away from the pulsating artifact, stumbling backwards, his mind reeling. The air in the derelict factory felt suddenly thin, suffocating. He understood now. This wasn't just a threat. It was a hungry, ancient god, slowly waking, and he was standing directly in its path. It was barely visible, a hairline fracture in the stone, almost imperceptible unless one knew precisely where to look. His grandfather, a man of profound secrets, had hidden this well. With a grunt, Dean applied pressure, first here, then there, tracing the outline. There was a faint click, a muffled sound of old stone shifting against stone. A small section of the flagstones, perhaps a foot square, hinged upwards, revealing a narrow, dusty cavity beneath. The air that wafted up was stale, thick with the scent of aged paper and something else, a faint metallic tang, like old blood or rust, that prickled the back of his throat. He peered into the gloom, a knot tightening in his chest. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed linen, were more journals. Not the neatly bound, leather-clad volumes he'd already devoured, but smaller, rougher notebooks, their covers worn smooth, their pages appearing brittle even from a distance. One, in particular, stood out. A slim black ledger, its corners dog-eared, its spine almost broken. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the cold, damp stone before he retrieved the books. They felt heavy, not just with their physical weight, but with the burden of untold knowledge. As he closed the secret compartment, the cottage seemed to sigh around him, a low, drawn-out sound that vibrated through the floorboards and up his spine. He glanced at the window, a sudden, inexplicable urge to check the relentless fog pressing against the glass. It felt thicker tonight, almost solid, as if the very air outside was curdling. He settled at the small wooden table, the black ledger before him. A shiver traced its way down his arms, raising goosebumps. As he opened the ledger, the air in the room grew heavy, a pressure building behind his eyes, a low thrumming that seemed to originate from deep within the earth, or perhaps within himself. The first few pages were a chaotic scrawl, his grandfather's handwriting deteriorating into frantic, almost illegible lines. Dean squinted, deciphering fragmented sentences. It demands more. The pact weakens. He could feel it now, not just a presence, but an intrusion. It was trying to breach the final wall. He gasped, gripping the edge of the table. A sudden image flashed in his mind, not a visual, but a sense of endless crushing pressure, of lightless depths, of something impossibly ancient stirring, unfurling. This wasn't just a haunting, it was an invasion. It wanted in, it wanted him. He flipped through the ledger, desperate, his eyes scanning for anything, any word that offered a reprieve. The pages detailed his grandfather's increasingly desperate attempts to contain the entity, to reinforce the failing barriers. Not enough. The breach grows. Need the iron. The deep core. Dean frowned. The old mill? He remembered seeing its skeletal remains on his maps, not far from the derelict factory on the mainland. His grandfather had always avoided that area in his casual conversations. Here, the handwriting was clearer, more deliberate, as if etched with grim resolve. It outlined a final, terrible measure. A ritual. The method was cryptic, involving the confluence of old iron and living blood, the binding sigils, and the anchor of a willing spirit. The location was starkly clear, the heart of the derelict factory where the old presses still stand. But the cost? Dean's eyes widened, his breath catching. The ritual required a sacrifice, not of an animal, not of some arcane object, but of a part of the one performing it. A piece of the self, the journal read, willingly severed, offered as a tether. A memory, a love, a truth. A piece of the self. What did that even mean? To willingly give up a memory? To sever a love? The thought was horrifying, a violation of his very being. It wasn't physical pain, but a deeper, more profound amputation. He thought of his recent tragedy, the raw wound that still festered within him. Was that what it wanted? The most cherished, most painful part of him? The choice was stark. Succumb, become a vessel for this ancient horror, or make a sacrifice that would leave him fundamentally altered, a fragment of who he once was. He had lost so much already. He would not lose himself entirely, nor would he allow this thing to consume the world beyond this island. He closed the ledger, his fingers trembling, but his gaze was fixed. The derelict factory. He knew what he had to do. He just had to find the courage to pay the price. The words from the journal still clung to Dean, a cold, tenacious film on his thoughts. A piece of the self. He had tried to rationalize it, to imagine a less devastating interpretation, but the chilling truth had already settled deep in his marrow. It wasn't a physical sacrifice. It was an excision of identity, a severing of the very threads that wove him together. To give up a memory, a love, that was a death more profound than any grave. Outside the cottage, the island had begun to bleed into the same terrifying reality that now clawed at Dean's mind. The air, once merely damp, now felt thick and viscous, a heavy blanket pressing down. A perpetual twilight had fallen, not the gentle dusk of evening, but a permanent, bruised purple hue that swallowed the horizon whole. The fog, an almost constant companion, had intensified, becoming an opaque, living thing that writhed and coiled around the cottage, pressing against the window panes like a blind, searching beast. He moved through the small rooms, his movements stiff, as if the air itself resisted him. The familiar creaks of the old wood were now accompanied by a low, guttural thrum that seemed to vibrate from the very foundations of the island. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears so much as felt in his teeth. A deep, resonant hum that spoke of immense, churning power beneath the waves. The entity was no longer merely stirring. It was awake, fully aware, and its malevolent will was reshaping the world around him. He ventured to the edge of the property, pushing through the oppressive mist. The familiar gulls were gone, replaced by the frantic, disoriented cries of smaller seabirds that flapped wildly, often colliding with the unseen barriers of the fog, dropping to the sand in bewildered heaps. The shore itself was a testament to the deepening horror. The usual gray shingle was now littered with kelp that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, and strange, gelatinous masses that writhed with an internal motion, like slow, agonizing heartbeats. The sea, usually a tempestuous but predictable force, now churned with an unnatural fury, waves crashing against the rocks, not with a roar, but with a wet, sucking gasp, as if the island itself was struggling for breath. Memories, once clear and cherished, flickered in his mind, edges blurring, details dissolving like old photographs left in the rain. He clutched the journal, its worn leather a small anchor in the maelstrom. He had to stop it. The journal's final pages, cryptic and desperate, pointed to a specific location, a place of convergence where the entity's hold was strongest and where the counter-ritual had to be performed. It was an old, crumbling map, hastily sketched, leading to the derelict factory on the island's northernmost point. A place long abandoned, left to decay, now serving as an unwitting altar for an ancient, hungry power. He packed a satchel, the journal, a lantern, a coil of rope, and a few meager provisions. Each item felt impossibly heavy, laden with the gravity of his purpose. His hands trembled, but his resolve, born of desperation and a profound, aching grief, remained unyielding. He had lost so much already. He would not lose himself entirely, not yet. Not until he had fought. The journey to the derelict factory was a nightmare rendered in shades of gray and purple. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy, the path choked with overgrown, thorny bushes that seemed to reach out with grasping fingers. He stumbled over unseen roots, the beam of his lantern carving a small, frantic circle in the suffocating fog. He finally saw it, a hulking, skeletal silhouette against the bruised sky, its broken windows like vacant eyes staring out into the gloom. The derelict factory. It was a monument to human industry and swift decay, now repurposed by something far older, far more enduring. As he approached, the low thrumming intensified, vibrating through the ground, up his legs, into his very bones. The massive metal doors, long rusted shut, had been torn from their hinges, lying twisted on the ground like discarded toys. Inside, the cavernous space was a labyrinth of corroded machinery, skeletal catwalks, and collapsed sections of roof that let in slivers of the unnatural light. Water dripped from unseen leaks, echoing loudly in the vast emptiness. The air here was even heavier, saturated with the metallic rotten smell and a cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers. In the center of the main assembly floor, where once great machines had stood, was a circular depression in the concrete, filled with a viscous, inky black liquid that shimmered with an inner light. It was the heart of the entity's influence, the focal point of its encroachment. Dean's eyes scanned the final instructions in the journal. The words, once abstract, were now brutally clear. The counter-ritual required not just the specific incantations, but a true sacrifice. A piece of himself, willingly given. It wasn't just a memory, he realized with a sickening lurch, but the anchor of his most profound grief. The love that defined him in the wake of his loss. To sever that, to excise the very essence of his mourning, would be to erase the person he had become, to make the tragedy meaningless, to forget the reason he sought to fight. The horror of it was almost unbearable, a psychological amputation more terrifying than any physical wound. With a deep, shuddering breath, Dean stepped towards the black pool, the journal clutched in his hand, his voice a dry rasp as he began to read the first lines of the counter-ritual. He would pay the price. It wasn't a physical sacrifice. It was an excision of something far more intimate, something woven into the very fabric of his being. It was the only currency the ancient entity would accept to seal its abyssal domain. The air around the lighthouse pulsed with an unseen pressure, a low thrum that vibrated in Dean's bones. The fog, usually a comforting shroud, now felt like a living, suffocating presence, churning with impossible bruised colors just beyond the perimeter of his vision. The entity was here, fully manifested not as a physical form, but as an overwhelming, crushing weight on the island's very spirit. It was a vastness that stretched beyond comprehension, a primordial hunger that had finally breached the veil. The lighthouse was a beacon, a point of ingress, but not the portal's true anchor. The core, the wound where the entity truly bled into their reality, lay elsewhere. It lay in a place of forgotten industry, of rot and metal, where the island's own sorrow had been allowed to fester. The derelict factory. Dean grabbed the journal, its pages brittle beneath his trembling fingers, and a heavy, tarnished brass key he'd found tucked inside. The wind outside howled, a mournful lament, and the ancient timbers of the lighthouse groaned in protest. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy, almost alive. He stumbled through the shifting mist, the path to the derelict factory a nightmare of distorted perspectives. The skeletal remains of trees clawed at the sky, their branches like gnarled fingers. He kept his eyes fixed on the faint, rusting silhouette of the factory, a grim monument of human decay mirroring the deeper, more ancient rot beneath. The ground here was slick with a black, viscous film that coated his boots with each step. He pushed open a protesting metal door, its shriek echoing through the vast, empty space within. Inside, the derelict factory was a cathedral of ruin. Rust-eaten machinery stood like petrified beasts, coated in a fine, greasy dust. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic drip of unseen water and the frantic thrumming of Dean's own blood in his ears. They spoke of loss, of inadequacy, of the moment he'd failed to protect her. Images flashed before his eyes. The accident, the shattered glass, the final vacant stare. His breath hitched, a strangled sob caught in his throat. This was the entity's psychological assault, preying on his deepest wound. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the journal until his knuckles ached. He followed the faint, almost imperceptible guidance from the journal, a series of crude symbols etched into its final pages, leading him deeper into the factory's labyrinthine interior. He passed massive, silent vats, their surfaces encrusted with an unfamiliar, iridescent green moss. Thump, thump, thump. Finally, he reached a vast circular chamber. Its ceiling collapsed in places, creating a gaping hole to the bruised sky. In the center of the floor, where a colossal boiler once stood, was a shimmering obsidian pool. This was it, the portal, the source. And from its depths, something stirred. Dean felt his mind reel, the edges of his vision blurring. The thump, thump, thump intensified, becoming a monstrous heartbeat. He fumbled for the key, the brass warm against his freezing skin. The journal indicated a specific point, a small, corroded iron grate set into the concrete beside the pool. With shaking hands, he inserted the key into the lock, turning it with a grinding protest. "Don't let go." Tears streamed down his face, but his resolve was iron. He knew this was the ultimate illusion, the final, most cruel trick. To seal the portal, he had to offer the piece of himself that kept him bound to this crushing sorrow, to sever the part of his soul that clung to the pain of his loss. It was not forgetting, but releasing. He closed his eyes, picturing her face, not in grief, but in pure, unadulterated love. The act was a brutal, spiritual amputation. The moment it was done, a piercing shriek ripped through the derelict factory, a sound that was both deafening and utterly silent, emanating from the obsidian pool. Dean collapsed, gasping, his body racked with tremors. The portal was sealing. But the cost. The grief was gone, replaced by a vast, aching emptiness. He had saved the island, perhaps the world, but he had sacrificed the very essence of what had made him him. He was free, but irrevocably diminished, a ghost haunting his own skin. It was the severing. A profound, searing ache bloomed in his chest, then withered, leaving behind an echoing void. The tears on his face dried, not from resolution, but from a sudden, terrifying emptiness. He felt lighter, impossibly so, as if a great weight had been lifted, only to be replaced by the crushing realization that the weight had been him. The roaring in his ears, a symphony of abyssal hunger, abruptly ceased. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, blinked against the gloom. He smelled stagnant water, old concrete, and something else, something subtly foul, like forgotten dreams turning sour. Above him, a vast skeletal network of girders reached towards a distant, grimy skylight that offered only a weak, milky luminescence. He pushed himself up, his limbs stiff, his body feeling like an ill-fitting suit of skin. He was no longer on the craggy shore of the island. He was in the derelict factory. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming, a cathedral of abandonment. Rust-eaten machinery, hulking and silent, lay half-submerged in pools of murky water that reflected the fractured light like dead eyes. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, draped from every high beam, swaying imperceptibly in currents of air Dean couldn't feel. Each step echoed unnervingly in the cavernous space. He had given it up, the anchor of his sorrow, to seal the gateway, to quiet the deep song. But the cost. The cost was more than he could have ever imagined. He stopped before a colossal, rusted furnace, its maw gaping like a forgotten maw. He had become part of it. The sacrifice had bound him, not just to the island, but to the very knowledge of what lay beneath. The entity was neutralized for now, but its song, though muted, still resonated within him. He looked down at his hands, expecting to see some visible mark, some telltale sign of his transformation. There was nothing, only the familiar lines of his palms, the worn skin. Yet, when he looked back up, the derelict factory seemed to shimmer. He saw movement in the periphery of his vision, a flicker of something vast and ancient in the murky water, a ripple that no falling debris could have caused. The reveal wasn't a grand, dramatic unveiling. It was a creeping, insidious understanding. He was not free. He was simply changed. The entity was no longer actively reaching for him, but its presence, its essence, had seeped into the fissures of his newly empty soul. He was a vessel, a repository of its truth, forever burdened with the knowledge of what lurked just beyond the veil. He walked deeper into the factory, drawn by an unseen current. The sounds of the world outside, the crashing waves, the cry of gulls, were distant, muffled, as if filtered through layers of water. He felt a profound isolation, not just from humanity, but from the very concept of a normal, unburdened life. Dean reached a wall of grimy windows, some shattered, others opaque with decades of dust and grime. He pressed his face close to one of the cleaner panes, peering out. The fog was still thick, clinging to the landscape like a shroud. It looked the same, yet to him, it was profoundly different. He was trapped. Not by physical chains, but by an invisible, unbreakable pact. He was the new guardian, destined to walk the edges of sanity, to carry the crushing weight of a truth no human mind was meant to comprehend. The immediate threat was neutralized, yes, but at the cost of his peace, his future, his very self. The island had claimed him, not in death, but in a far more terrifying, enduring way. He turned from the window, the vast, echoing factory stretching before him, a mausoleum of forgotten industry and a new, terrible sanctuary for his fractured soul. The tension in the air was palpable, a constant thrum against his nerves, a promise of eternal vigilance,